I've done everything and I still don't get your picture. Maybe I have to call him back again.
Is all right.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm getting electricity and everything.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. Well, think I'm a dummy. I worked it one time and it's been 3 months ago.
Well, if you're like me, you forget those.
I'm not very mechanical minded. Well, this is Fran Nulph again. I can't get a picture. I've got the record, it's REC on it, and I'm not picking up a picture. Uh-huh. Oh, no. Oh, this is my first time. Hold on just a second. Is the lens cap off? Of course it's not off. Okay, I've got you. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye. She thinks I'm dumb. I know I'm dumb. Okay. That's a good picture. I think the light will be good.
No reflection from this window.
Just a little bit on the side of your face, but it's not a shadow. It's not bad. It's not on your glasses or anything. Okay, I suppose that's recorded everything we've been saying since I pushed it. Well, I can edit that out.
You see, I have little ones around.
Yes, I can see. This is an interview with Helen Crews, October the 12th, 1988, in her home, made by Fran Nulph for the Oklahoma Historical Society. Mrs. Crews, where were you born?
In Lafayette, Illinois.
And what about your parents?
Well, my daddy was a doctor, an early day doctor in Illinois, and when I was just a tiny baby, he decided that Oklahoma seemed like an up-and-coming place, and so he came down here and bought a number of farms. So we were always interested in Oklahoma. From the time I have any memory, we were talking about moving to Oklahoma someday.
And what year did he move?
In 1919, we came down here, and Daddy retired as a doctor and managed his business affairs here.
How old were you then?
I was 16.
I see. What year were you born?
1903.
1903. Well, you've seen a lot of changes in the town of Enid and in Oklahoma in those days.
Oh, very definitely. I remember our first home was on North Van Buren. The little brick house still stands, and Van Buren was not even paved. And at first there was a 2-lane road by our house to Broadway.
My goodness, it has come a long ways, hasn't it? You say your father came here in, what year did you say?
He came here in 1904 and bought land.
Uh-huh.
And My first trip to Oklahoma was when I was 5 years old.
Oh, do you remember anything about that?
Oh, I certainly do.
Could you share it with us?
Well, Daddy thought that he should come down and look about the harvest, but he was too busy, too many babies being born in our area. And so Mother brought me, and we came to Oklahoma to look after the harvest. Mother was a city girl, knew nothing about wheat harvest, but my most vivid memory was some distant relatives, the Athertons from Waukomis, met us in a horse and buggy and took us around to see the harvest. And then we had land up around Waukeeta, and Mother thought we should go and look about that. So we took the Rock Island train to Medford, and then we got the caboose on the little freight train to Waukeeta and Gibbon, which was a little town that's non-existent now. I think there's still an elevator there. But our first night in a little hotel in Waukeeta, a storm came up, and the old gentleman who ran the hotel came and knocked on our door and said, "Come quick to the cellar. We're going to have a cyclone." In those days, a tornado was a cyclone. And I remember how very frightened I was, and how Mother said, if we can ever get out of Oklahoma, we're going to do it.
Those storms are scary, aren't they?
Well, to a little child, it was frightening.
Do you have any other childhood remembrances that you'd like to share with us? Any special things that maybe how you spent your holidays? Do you remember?
You mean after I came to Oklahoma?
Or as a small child, either one?
Well, of course, we always went to my grandmother's for Christmas, and we lived in Toulon, which was about 6 miles from LaFayette, and we used to have a sleigh.
Oh.
And Daddy would always have the livery stable fix up a sleigh with sleigh bells, and we would go over the snow to Grandma's house for Christmas.
How exciting.
It was fun.
I can imagine.
Of course, I was an only child, and my parents were both older when I was born, so I suppose I was a spoiled little girl.
I imagine so.
And my daddy's first car he got when I was 5 years old. It was an Overland touring car, and it had no front doors, and it had running boards on the sides. And I remember the horn was a big ball-like thing, and it was very hard, and you had to squeeze it in order to make the horn honk. And it was my ambition to get big enough and strong enough to squeeze that horn.
Oh, for goodness sakes. What type of work did you say your father did?
He was a doctor.
I see. And did your mother work?
No.
Just had around the home she worked, I bet.
Well, no, she really didn't do much.
Oh, really?
Everyone said Mother was Dr. Church's spoiled darling.
Oh.
She always had a housekeeper, and until I was 4, I had a nurse.
Oh.
So Mother enjoyed parties and luncheons, and she wasn't very strong, so I think that's the reason she took life rather easy.
Do you remember any stories that your mother and father told you, maybe of your grandparents, of their times?
Well, of course, my daddy's mother, Grandma Church, was the first white child born in Stark County, Illinois. So she remembers many things and would tell me about the time she went into Toulon to the courthouse to hear the Lincoln-Douglas debate and forgot about her bread in the oven and burned it up. And one of my fond memories, sounds like it was really ancient history, but one of my little playmates' grandfather was a doctor dentist, and he pulled Abraham Lincoln's tooth, and he had it in his office, and as a little girl I would go to see Abraham Lincoln's tooth.
Oh my. Did your grandmother, did she live in a sod house or a log cabin or anything?
Oh, no, no.
Did she tell you tales of her mother?
Well, just about the early days, and they called them the horse and buggy days, and I used to go by the little country school where my daddy had his first schooling, and my grandfather came from New York State and was, they called him Dr., not Dr. Church, but T.D. Church, who was the gentleman farmer. He raised fancy grapes, and as I recall, he had 50-some varieties of grapes in his vineyard. He thought that was a good hobby. But before I was born, they had moved to town, to Lafayette. See, these towns were just 6 miles apart. And I know they had a big house, and it was the first real bathroom in town. So Grandma used to say, now be careful. We'll have to carry a bucket of water upstairs to the bathroom if you use the toilet too much.
Oh. What about your school? Where did you go to school?
Well, I started to school in Lafayette, my first 2 grades, and then in Toulon. And then I came to Enid when I was, well, it was before I was 16. I was 15. And I started to Enid High School as a junior. And it was just when boys were coming back from the ROTC programs, and they were in uniform and great big men to me because I was rather small. And the first class I went into in Enid High School, the teacher got mad at the boy sitting back of me and threw an eraser at him and hit me. And that was quite a shock because I had been in a smaller school where I was sort of the pet of all the teachers. And then the next class I went in was a chemistry class, and they were all boys, all men, you know. And they asked me if I brought my doll along. And then we went for lunch, and I had never been in a cafeteria without Mother being along. So I got my food, but I forgot to get any silver. So the only thing I could eat was my banana.
Well.
And by the time the day was out, I was thoroughly heartbroken to think that I was going to have to go to that awful school. So the next day, we went out to Phillips, and there was a high school at Phillips at that time. And they welcomed me with open arms, and I enrolled at Phillips High School, and I could take college work along with my high school work in drama. And so I thoroughly enjoyed my work at Phillips in the high school department.
Did you go to Phillips to college too?
I got a degree from there,
You did.
and then went to the University of Chicago.
Did you graduate from the University of Chicago?
No, my graduation happened just 2 weeks before my husband graduated, when we had our little daughter, Naomi.
Well, for you,
So I didn't get my second degree from the University of Chicago, but I could have gone on and had it transferred to Phillips, but I didn't do it. I was too busy, too involved with many things in Enid. You know, you get involved with many things in Enid.
That's true, yes. You mentioned the men coming back from ROTC. Did your mother do anything to help with the war effort?
No, my mother didn't, but my daddy was called into service, and he had anemia. He was very anemic, and so they gave him his choice of going as an optometrist on a battleship or going to teach in a medical school or going to a small town where the doctors had all gone to the into the service. And he decided he would go to the small town where the doctors had all gone in the service, and Mother could go with him. So that left me as a little girl, well, not too little, but too young to be left alone, to visit a room with a friend of Mother's who kept high school kids. And so that was my wartime experience, being separated from my parents. I would go weekends to where they were.
And what year would that have been?
Well, that would have been 17 and 18.
Do you remember anything about the flu epidemic in 1918?
Yes, I do.
Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it was so severe, of course, and there weren't people to help. Even the nurses were not there available to help the doctors. And so Daddy taught me how to mix some powders together, I don't know what they consisted of now, but he had his flu powders. And I mixed many a batch of powders in his office and helped him all I could, and I would run errands and do things of that sort for my daddy, who was taking care of all the patients.
Do you know about how many people died around where you were living then?
I don't remember.
It was quite an epidemic, I remember.
Yes,
reading about
very
it.
bad.
What do you remember about the land opening? When your people, your relatives that made the land opening, the run to the Cherokee Outlet?
Well, I have heard many, many tales and practically lived it with Aunt Laura. Aunt Laura Crews was Everett's aunt. I guess I didn't tell you that I married Everett in 1923, and became part of a large family, from just myself and Mother and Daddy to a big family. And so I got well versed in the run into the Cherokee Strip, and the Aunt Laura often talked about how she wanted to make the run. She was just barely old enough, and her brother Will was a couple of years older, and they wanted to ride horseback into the on the run. And so Aunt Laura's mother said that if she was going to ride astride, as she called it, she'd have to have a split skirt, because no lady would ride without a skirt. So she made her a split skirt so that she could ride astride. And Everett's father, who was a couple of years younger, drove the wagon with their supplies and followed. And he actually made the run, but he couldn't stake a claim because he wasn't old enough.
And where did Aunt Laura stay?
Well, it's about 4 miles, 3 or 4 miles, I think it's 4 miles north of Covington and a mile east of Highway 74. And her brother staked the claim to the east of hers, and so they had to both live on their claims. So they built a border house, half of the house on his claim and half on hers, so they could live together and prove up on both claims. But as soon as Everett's father was old enough to buy a claim, he bought the relinquishment on the farm just north of theirs and proved up on that. In fact, I have the original deed signed by Teddy Roosevelt on that farm. He bought 240 acres, and immediately the east half of it was all a rocky pasture land, and he quarried the stone out of the pasture to build a stone house, which he and his brother built together. And I think it was 20 by 20 feet. And in that house, they raised 6 children. It was pretty cramped quarters, I imagine.
It must have been.
But this Everett's father had hardly gotten his family together and raised when he met with an accident and was killed. And Everett was 6 years old at that time. And his youngest sister was just still a baby. So I'm sure they had plenty of hard times.
Did you remember Aunt Laura telling of any of the hardships that they must have gone through?
Oh, yes. They, of course, raised all of their food that they possibly could, and she staked the land where she did because it was on Black Bear Creek, and she had understood that the land was always more fertile next to a creek. It wasn't the pretty laying land, but it was fertile land. And So as after Everett's father died, his mother contracted pneumonia and died within a year. And so Aunt Laura and Grandmother Crews, her mother, took the 6 children into their home to raise. The older boys were old enough to help with the farming and do the chores and all that. Everett being only 7 at the time, wasn't big enough to do anything but herd cattle and, as he said, clean the chickens because they lived on chickens that they raised and gathering eggs and so forth.
Those first few years must have been very hard. I understand there was a drought and it didn't rain. The crops failed for 3 or 4 years, I understand.
They raised garden stuff and cattle and made butter, and Aunt Laura would ride on her horse into Garber and sell her butter at a premium because it was such good butter. And her butter and eggs kept them in groceries. The children went to a country school. I believe they called it Lone Star, but they had to walk 2 miles over the pastures to school. And all 8 grades in one school. Must have been pretty tough.
It must have been. I imagine your husband has told you quite a few tales of their life, too, together.
Oh, yes, of course. He's told me about how they had to sleep in the attic. The boys all slept in the attic. And when it snowed, the snow would sift in under the shingles, and in the mornings they would be under a blanket of snow sometimes. Pretty cold.
Mm-hmm. We've had some hard winters here.
Yes. I'm afraid our children today wouldn't exist very long.
No, we're spoiled, I believe. Well, can you think of anything else? Now, Aunt Laura, she never married, did she?
No, she always said, I'm an old maid by choice, but don't ask me whose choice.
And how long did she live?
To be 105.
My goodness.
And her mental facilities were alert clear up to the last few weeks of her life.
Oh, what a blessing. My goodness.
She drove her own car when she was 99, but before she got to be 100, we convinced her that she would be better off not to live alone anymore, and she went to the Methodist home to live, gave up her car.
Well, when did she move into Enid?
1922, I believe, 21 or 2. And she and the grandmother bought a large house on the corner of Pine and Washington that after she was gone, we let the Salvation Army take that house, and I don't know whether they moved it away or tore it down, but that's the Salvation Army playground now.
Oh, I see. Well, did she used to live in a house that was a hospital at one time?
Well, that was the house.
Well, that's it.
Uh-huh.
We have a photograph of it at the museum, and
Well, it was a large 2-story house, and in her later years, she converted it into a duplex because it was too much for her to look after, and so she lived in the downstairs and rented the upstairs. But she was very active in civic affairs, and she loved to act. When she was in her 70s and so forth, she went out to Phillips and took courses in drama and was in quite a few plays, and she was so happy when she could do things of that sort. And she did write 7 different books, had them published.
I didn't realize she had written books.
Oh yes, I have all of her books. And she started out after she was alone and wanted someone to live with her and keep company. Mabel McClure, who was the librarian at that time at the public library, wanted to live with her. And so they traveled together and did many things together, Aunt Laura and Mabel. They went to Europe together way back when, and Mabel got her interested in writing. She wanted her to write her family history or something about each member of the family. And so that was her first book. But then she wrote a book on family poetry, have every family member write a poem, and family recipes, and the military records of the Crews family. And I don't remember what the other titles were, but she was quite enthusiastic about her writing.
While we're talking about the Crews family, would you like to tell me a little bit about your husband's family? His mother and father? And
well, of course, his parents died when he was very young, but he had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. And his oldest brother, Ralph, he graduated from the University of Michigan as a scientist. And can we turn that off?
you were telling me about Everett's brothers and sisters.
Well, his brother Ralph was a chemist or a scientist at Continental in Ponca City when he was killed in a car wreck. And that was a good many years ago. Then his brother Charles died about, I imagine, 12 years ago. He was retired. And his brother Robert was also retired, and he died probably 15 years ago. And then his sister Mary lives in Oceanside, California. She has 3 daughters, and they're all in California. And her youngest sister, Amy, lives in Denver. And their only child died about a year ago. So it isn't a big family anymore.
What about Everett's grandparents?
Well, I never knew anything. I never knew except his one grandmother. And she died of cancer in October of 1923. So I never had much contact with the grandparents except this one grandmother, Grandmother Crews. And before we were married, you see, Everett and I were married just a week after he graduated from high school, being made an orphan when he was 7. He missed his first 2 years of school, so he didn't graduate until he was 20 years old from Enid High. And so before we were married, Grandma Crews asked me to come and visit with her one afternoon, and she made me promise that I would see to it that Everett got a college education. And so we went to the University of Chicago until he graduated.
Well, what did your husband do for a living?
Well, he was in the insurance business to start out with, but when he died, he was in several different businesses. He was always very much interested in the oil business, and so he had his own producing oil company, and he loved his Old Hereford cattle. He started as a hobby with that, and it grew into a business. And then he managed all of the farms. So when he died, I had 4 distinct businesses that I had to take over and run. So that was quite a challenge for me.
I know it was.
Perhaps I should go back a ways and tell you that when the Garber-Covington oil field was discovered, it was in 1916. No, 1919. The first farm was on the land adjoining the Crews land, Aunt Laura's land. But the second and third wells were on their land. And so it was after oil was discovered and times became a little more prosperous that Aunt Laura moved to Enid.
I see.
And we had many interesting experiences in the old Garber-Covington oil field. After it was discovered that the lease Aunt Laura had given on the children's land was not a legal lease, because it seems that land belonging to minor children has to be advertised for 5 days and then sold to the highest bidder. And the land was never advertised or sold to the highest bidder, so it was not a legal lease. And so they sued for the cancellation of the lease and decided that the boys would drill their own wells. But in order for them to do that, it being in litigation, it had to be that all of the, except the royalty, had to be put in escrow pending settlement of the lawsuit. So that made it so we didn't get anything but the royalty out of it anyway, but the money was put in escrow, and later, when the lawsuit was settled in our favor and we were to receive the money, the very day, the very night that we were to get the money the next day, this banker was found shot to death north of Garber, and the money was gone. So although we might have had quite a little, it sort of vanished.
Well, for goodness sakes.
But Everett and I said, well, why worry about it? We're young, we have a good education, we can make it on our own. So we just started out from scratch and made it on our own.
Guess that was a booming time in the Covington Garber oil fields.
Oh, yes. Many exciting things happened out there. I know one night we were out, we were going to watch a well come in, and we went in to Garber to eat our dinner. And we overheard a conversation about us, saying that when we left, why they were going to hold us up on the way back to Enid. So we got another car to come along with us. And I remember very distinctly putting my engagement ring in my bra because I thought they wouldn't look there for it. And that was my only diamond at the time. And I thought if they held me up, I didn't want to lose that.
Don't blame me.
About 2 cars of us came along together and we weren't held up.
Do you remember any tales about the oil industry, other than the one that you told me about the litigation? Any experiences or anything?
Oh, I remember one night we were bringing in a well, or we thought we were, out the other side of Pawnee. That's not in the Cherokee Strip, I guess, but it's a little town over east. And I had been out of town. I'd been in Colorado and just got back along early evening, and Everett was over at this well, and he thought it was going to come in. And he had left word for me to drive on over there to see the well come in. So I drove on over to Pawnee, found this well, and it was back in the days when they drilled with, they had big belts on the machinery, sort of like old thrashing machine things. And so along about 11 o'clock at night, we had a big electrical storm, and they had to shut down because the belts slipped and they couldn't do anything. So we went into Pawnee to find a hotel to go to bed. And we went into this old hotel, the only one there, and asked if we had a room, and they said no, not in the main hotel, but they had one out back. And about that time, the lights went out. And the fellow sitting at a stool next to ours said, "I've got a flashlight. I'm the I'm the sheriff. I'll take you back to your room. So we went back through the alley to a little shed back there, there were a couple of rooms back there, and that was our hotel room. It was so dirty, and I could see bugs around, and I wouldn't even take my clothes off. Well, of course, I didn't have any spare clothes with me anyway, but we spent a most terrible night back there. And the next morning we went out to the well, and they had started it up, and it had come in dry.
Oh.
Of course, you know, that's to be expected in the oil business.
Yes, I guess so. This is a kind of funny question, but were you a flapper?
Well, the Crews family thought I was, because I sort of liked pretty clothes, and I liked to have a good time, and they thought that Everett was marrying some little flapper who was after his money. But it proved that my folks had more money than the Crewses. And I don't think I was a flapper, really.
Did you bob your hair?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, I bobbed my hair. I remember one time I was watching a well. They were drilling it, and they used to have slush pits down under the derrick, and they have mud in those slush pits, and the hole went down in the middle of the slush pit, and the wooden derricks, you know, they were all wood. And I decided I wanted to climb up on the derrick and look down. And I had on a brand new rose-colored heavy linen dress that was real pretty. It had embroidery on and everything. It was one of my better dresses. And so I started climbing up the derrick. And Everett says, "You better not do that." And I said, "Well, but I want to do it." So I was up a few rungs on the ladder, and my foot slipped. It was greasy, oily, you know. And I started to fall in the slush pit. And he grabbed, and all he got a hold of was that rose linen dress. But it was a good substantial dress, and it held my weight, and I didn't get a slush pit.
Well, that was a close call.
That was a close call.
How did the Depression affect you and your family?
Well, it really affected us because it was right at that time that we lost, well, or right after, in the Depression days, that all this money was stolen, and of course it was impossible to recover any of it. And Aunt Laura had invested what little royalty money we had in second mortgages. And so we found that the only way we could save what we were supposed to have was by taking property. And we had 3 apartment buildings. They weren't first-class apartment buildings, but they were about as good as we had in Enid at that time. And they were all run down in terrible shape. So we started to refurnish, redecorate, and rejuvenate 3 apartment buildings. And it was my job to get the furniture as cheaply as possible. I went to wholesale houses in Oklahoma City and Wichita and furnished those apartments and redecorated, made curtains. I think I must have made hundreds of curtains. And then on weekends, we'd have to stay home to listen for the telephone to see if we could show an apartment, rent an apartment, and most of them rented for $20 to $30 a month, furnished. So that affected us quite a little bit. It really made us work. But I guess it was good for us.
I imagine it. Have you ever lived through a dust storm?
Yes, I have.
Tell me about those.
Well, I remember one day, Amy Carl, I don't know whether you know Amy, but for many years, she has had a hot cross bun party on Ash Wednesday every year. So this Ash Wednesday, she was having her hot cross bun party, and you could hardly see to drive. She lived out on the east side of town, and I know I gathered up 2 or 3 friends, and we went to Amy's hot cross bun party, and she couldn't even keep buns clean.
Oh my.
Dust was so thick, and the windowsills were just piled up. You couldn't see more than a block to drive. It wasn't as bad at my house because I had storm windows, and that kept out part of the dirt, dust and dirt. It was pretty bad.
I'd hate to be caught out in one. You just couldn't breathe, could you at all?
No, you had to put a handkerchief over your nose, and then it would be brown.
Did many people have dust pneumonia? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Do you remember if there were soup lines in this area?
Oh, yes. When they called a group of us together and asked us to take care of the charity in Garfield County, and the government sent in salt pork and beans, and a group of us went down and measured out the beans and cut the pork and wrapped it and so forth for the poor to come and get. And that's how junior welfare started.
Oh, really?
And we were charter members of junior welfare. And then we started the soup kitchen up where the old fire station was, up North Independent, no, Grand is, well, an old fire station up there. And we made soup and peanut butter sandwiches. And we started the school lunch program.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to make 700 or 800 peanut butter sandwiches every day for school lunches, and big 5-gallon cans of soup. And we used to get our peanut butter in 10-gallon containers. And some of us kind of sneaked a little extra peanut butter and made our sandwiches a little extra heavy with the peanut butter because we felt that those kids needed that extra food.
There just wasn't much food at all during the Depression.
No.
What about floods and disasters? You told me about the cyclone coming. Have you lived through some floods near Enid?
Well, the worst flood we had was about is it 12 to 14 years ago. That's the only time it's ever come up in this neighborhood. But we've had floods out in the east part of town. Well, in fact, the night we were married, after our wedding, we were going to spend the night here and then go the next morning to Colorado. And a cloudburst happened that night, and it was all flooded down through Springs Park and all through there, and the Salt Fork River was flooded. It washed the bridge out by Pond Creek, and we couldn't get away on our honeymoon for 2 weeks. We couldn't get across the Salt Fork River.
Yeah.
But, and then one time when Van Buren was just a 2-lane road, and we lived at 1305 Indian Drive. Our next door neighbor, Doc McKay, was coming home from his drugstore late at night, and the water was rushing across Van Buren and Market at that time, and it washed his car off the highway on down the creek, and he had to swim out.
Oh my.
So we've had floods, but this last one, before we instigated the flood control, came up onto our driveway a little bit, and there were some fence posts floating around in the street out in front of our house, but it didn't get into our house.
Well, that's good. That was the only flood that I ever lived through, and it was scary.
Uh-huh.
I lived right over there on the drainage ditch on Indian Terrace.
Oh, you did?
Yes, so it was pretty bad. What about World War II? Did you support the war effort in any way? Did you?
Oh, yes.
do anything
I was in charge of making the bandages for the Red Cross. And, of course, we did a lot of selling of bonds and doing things of that sort. Did everything we could.
Did you knit or wrap the bandages?
I wrapped the bandages. Oh, I knit sweaters too.
Oh.
And still do.
You do. Do you remember VE and VJ Day?
Yes.
Did you know of anyone that ever rode the Chisholm Trail? Did you know any
No, I didn't.
cowpunchers or anything? What about dances and recreation? Did you like to dance when you were a girl?
Why, of course.
Did you go, what kind of socials or what kind of entertainment did you
Well,
have?
of course, we had lots of school entertainments, school clubs, and dinner parties and things of that sort, and then lots of church activities, and church picnics and swimming parties, and I loved to swim. And
Do you remember any chivalries? They don't do that anymore, do they?
well, they were going to do that for us on our wedding night, and the storm came up, and they didn't get there. But I never participated in any. I guess it was mostly the people who had lived in the country, I think, who participated in those things. And I never was fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to live in the country.
Did you ever see any medicine shows or anything like that?
Not really. I can tell you way back of an incident when in Illinois when I was a little girl. They used to have bands of gypsies come through the country in their covered wagons, and so one night late at night, this band of gypsies had camped outside of our little town, and this man came to our door and said they needed the doctor. They needed him quick. And Daddy said, "What is the matter?" And they said, "Our princess is very ill. We need a doctor quick." Mother says, "Oh, don't go there, that's dangerous." But Daddy said, "No, if she's sick, I'll go." So he went, and she had just eaten a lot of peanuts and had the stomach ache. But they were so grateful to think that he would come to their gypsy camp and all. And they gave him beautiful silk shawls to take to Mother, and because he wouldn't take any pay for going to see the princess. But he said she had the most gorgeous clothes and negligees and things. It was just really something. Mm-hmm. But Mother and I were scared to death to have Daddy go to the gypsy camp.
What is your opinion of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and the New Deal?
The first time I voted in my life was for Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm a staunch Republican. But that was in Chicago when we were in school, and we had to go to an incomplete apartment building and vote in the basement of this apartment building. And I thought I was so big because that's the first time I was old enough to vote. But, of course, I think we have been sorry for many things that he did. I did get to hear Eleanor Roosevelt one time in the United Nations in New York, which was quite a, well, I thought that was quite a thrill to hear her.
She was quite a lady, wasn't she?
Yes, she certainly was.
What is your opinion of the WPA?
Well, I guess it helped a lot of people, but it made people depend on government too much.
Do you think the good old days really were the good old days, in your opinion?
Well, when you think of the inconvenience of not having all of the modern equipment that we have to keep house with now, I don't know whether they were the good old days or not. Of course, in the good old days, I happened to be fortunate enough to always have a maid to do my heavy work, and so it didn't bother me, the fact that we didn't have modern electric stove and all that sort of thing. And we even had an ice box the first few years that we were married, but soon got an electric, one of these GEs with a round thing on top, you know.
Who do you think was the greatest man in American history?
Well, I've always admired Abraham Lincoln.
Who do you think was the greatest woman?
Well, as a very young person, I admired Jane Addams in the Hull House because my daddy worked with her and did part of his internship with her in Chicago, and he thought Jane and she hung the moon
Well,
because she did so much work among the poor in Chicago. But nationwide, of course, she wasn't. But I did think she was a great person.
who do you think is the greatest American president?
You're putting me on the spot. There have been a number of great ones.
It's hard to choose one, isn't it? What about the greatest Oklahoma governor? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think Governor Bellman is a very fine governor. He's in his second go-round. Of course, I thought Governor Nye was a very personable person. I liked him very much personally.
Well, we've kind of skipped around here. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell me, to share with us, that I haven't asked you a question about, that you have in your mind that might be interesting?
Well, I can't think of anything right now. It seems like you've covered the waterfront pretty well.
Well, I want to thank you for this interview. I certainly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Fran, for asking me, and I hope it helps someone sometime.
Yes, it will. Thank you very much.
Okay.